Good morning and welcome to Business Minds. I'm Cindy Bird and I'm flying solo today. Unfortunately, my fabulous, beautiful co host Melissa Smith is home with two sick little ones. So let's please keep them in our thoughts and prayers that they get well very soon. There's so much going around right now, and she's where she needs to be with those little ones right now. I want to remind you of our theme for the month of February, which is Infusing Heart into Your Business. And Melissa and I chose this theme because it focuses on individual well being and workplace well being. Last week, when we talked about managing thoughts to manage stress, that was more focused on individual well being. And today, we're going to focus more on the well-being of your company by taking a look at evaluating your company culture. I want to remind you why I'm wearing red and why we're wearing red for the entire month of February. It is American Heart Month, and certainly that ties into our theme of infusing heart into your business, paying attention to your well-being and to the well-being of your company. Heart disease is the number one cause of death in the United States among both men and women, and in support of the Go Red for Women movement, Melissa and I have chosen to wear red every one of our shows during the month of February. So as business coaches, as I call myself a thinking partner when I'm out working with my clients, both Melissa and I have talked about the fact that we tend to get questions related to organizational culture. So I want to take time today to answer some of those questions for you and really delve into this topic of evaluating your company culture. So a good place to start, of course, is with the question, what is organizational culture? And whenever I taught this subject at Robert Morris University, especially when I was teaching international marketing and organizational behavior both, to explain the concept of culture, it's a little easier when you think about it in terms of a country. When my students were studying international marketing, they had to understand the different cultures of the countries in which they might want to market a product. And families are another example of understanding culture, that families as well as countries have certain beliefs, certain customs, traditions, rituals. They are all derived, though, from their values and beliefs. So when you look at a formal definition of organizational culture, it's that it's shared attitudes, values, beliefs, customs, written rules, and here's an interesting fact, it's also the unwritten rules. And that we'll delve into a little bit more this morning. And these are things that develop over time and become simply the way you do things around here, whether it's around your family, around a country, or around your business, of course, is the focus for today's topic. Culture is highly ingrained into the way we do our work. Again, when you look at a family, think about those traditions that your family has. I know in my family, there's a lot of traditions that surround the Christmas holidays. And back when my kids were little, when I first started having little ones, it was becoming more challenging to get up early and uh, tear them away from their gifts from Santa to go over to my in-laws where they were wanting to celebrate bright and early as well. And I suggested that perhaps we could do our family gathering the night before on Christmas Eve. And wow, that did not go over very well. So those traditions are very ingrained, and that happens in a business as well. Another story that I used to share with my students about this concept of culture and how strong traditions are is about a newlywed young woman who's going to cook a ham for a family holiday dinner for the first time. And she's in the kitchen getting ready to put the ham in the roasting pan. And her mom says, well, now make sure you cut both ends off the ham. And the daughter says, oh, why do I do that? She said, well, that's what my mom taught me. Mom always said, cut both ends off the ham, or, I watched her do that. Well, why did she do that? Well, because her mother, your great grandma. And so, well, great grandma happened to be in the other room. So the daughter's curious enough, she goes into great grandma and she says, great grandma, so I'm hearing that it's traditional that you cut off both ends of the ham before you put it in the roasting pan. And why is that? Grandma says, well, that was the only way I could get it to fit in the pan. So oftentimes we fall into these traditions, both in our families and in our organizations, that maybe aren't really serving us as well as they could be. They're not really contributing to the well being of the company. They're not contributing to how well we want to function, how productive we want to be, how high performing of an organization we want to be, and whether or not we want to be a place where people want to work and want to stay and be there. So, some other things that culture uh, is an extension of, or it extends to, if you think about it, your vision being why, your purpose for having your business, your mission is your what you do to fulfill that purpose. Think about your culture as being your how, driven by your philosophy, your beliefs, your values, how you're going to carry out your business, how you're going to interact with employees, how they're going to interact with customers. What are your policies and procedures going to be? What are all the systems going to be that you have in place? What about your marketing and advertising practices? What about your policies with regards to attendance and punctuality? And if you have a dress code, how formal is your culture? How informal is your culture? Um, Things like communication style, communication protocol, the levels of decision making or how you handle decision making in your organization. What's the physical environment like? All of these things are an outgrowth of your culture. So, another question that we get often is if I'm starting a business, how do I create the culture to begin with? Well, as I just mentioned, if your vision is your purpose, your why, and your mission is your what, your culture comes from your philosophy. What beliefs and values are driving uh, the business that you're wanting to create? I'm going to use a corporate example first, and that's Southwest Airlines. It's a very interesting story. We all know that they're a very successful airline, and a lot of that has to do with the culture that they've created and maintained from the beginning. Herb Kelleher was one of the founders of Southwest Airlines, and interestingly, Southwest didn't necessarily set out to just be an airline. They set out to build and be a champion for a cause. They were the champion for the common man. That was really their purpose, their why. Why did that come about? In the 1970s, airline travel was very complicated. It was um, almost exclusive to the business executives, the wealthy individual, because it was very expensive. And it also was costly then. People didn't want to fly much. So he's like, well, why can't we be the champion for the common man? Why can't we appeal to the average person and give them the freedom to travel? So freedom is a very strong value that was established early on. And they wanted to build a culture that was centered around cheap, fun, and simple. So if this is a freedom is a prominent belief, you hear that in their advertising messages. You're free to move about the country now. Bags fly free. It's built into their systems and their methods, how they keep costs low. That is part of the culture. Flying only one kind of plane. So they only have to maintain that one kind of plane. Pilots understand that one kind of plane. State of the art baggage handling systems. They hire people with positive attitudes and energy. Kelleher's famous for saying, hire for attitude, train for skill. And then they give those individuals the freedom to act autonomously, to decide how they're going to make that flying experience fun and engaging for the customer. And simple. They have systems that remove those complexities. So let's take that down to a small business example. And this comes from actually a mythical example from Michael Gerber's book, The E-Myth. If you've read that book, you know that he talks with a fictitious business owner named Sarah, and Sarah has a pie making business. And when he's talking to Sarah about culture and how to establish the culture of her business, he really guides her back to the fact that she's not just selling pies. She is wanting to create a culture that lives out her philosophy that she learned from her aunt, and that is to put a lot of care into everything that you do. So Gerber calls your culture establishing the rules of the game. So Sarah's going to focus on rules about how her employees dress, their appearance, their attitude, the care that goes into cleanliness and keeping things organized, the proper way to heat ovens and clean them, and using only quality ingredients. But it's also the care that she wants them to put into interacting with the customer. It's about bringing your spirit, bringing your best self to the interaction. And then she's going to model the way too and bring her best self and her caring spirit to her interactions with her employees, vendors, customers, everyone. So when you're starting up a business, those are things to take into consideration. Also, the nature of the type of business that you're starting or the industry in which you're operating can be some guides to what are you going to do to establish the most effective culture. For example, if you're entering into a high-tech industry, you probably want to strive for a very innovative culture where there's a lot of opportunity for people to be creative, to have the freedom to come up with new ideas because you've got to constantly be on that cutting edge. If you are a restaurant, in the restaurant industry, there are a lot of regulations to follow because you want those 100-point healthcare inspections, right? So your culture is probably going to be one of a little more formality and regulation because it has to be, as opposed to that high-tech, unstructured, informal culture that might be if you're in that kind of business. If you're in sales, a lot of culture that comes from a sales-oriented company has to do with being very market-oriented. So a lot of focus on results, a lot of focus on making sure you're understanding what your competitors are doing. Another question that I want to really get into now, though, is now that you know if I'm a startup, how do I create a company culture? Why is it important to evaluate company culture? So, whether you're just starting up or especially if you're established in business, there are 5 reasons why it's important to evaluate company culture. The first one is that every company has a culture, but not every culture is healthy. And you're not going to know if your culture is healthy or not if you're not evaluating it on a consistent basis. Secondly, it's your culture that endures. People are going to come and go from your business as employees. Customers are going to come and go potentially. But your culture is the foundation. It's a foundational piece. It's going to help you effectively deal with new problems, new challenges, new strategies, new goals that you want to pursue along the way. The third reason is tied to strategy. While a company without strategy lacks direction, a strategy without a culture is like a sports team without spirit. Culture trumps strategy every time. I had a client I worked with several years ago that had not ever put a strategic plan in place, and we went back to the beginning with vision and mission, involved a lot of employees in the process, really helped them have ownership in what we were doing. And when we got to the piece of creating a culture that would support that new strategy, the owners were not quite as on board with what I was suggesting, and that we needed to go into more beliefs, values, some guiding principles. And I'm working on behalf of my clients, so I'm honoring my client's request that they want to stop at the point we were at. About 8 months later, I get a call. Things aren't going so well. Our strategies aren't really being implemented as we had envisioned them being implemented. Well, the piece that was missing was addressing the culture. Their culture was not as healthy as it needed to be in order for those new strategies to work. So we had to go back and do some work on evaluating the culture and making sure that we were actually creating a culture that was going to support those new strategies. A fourth reason that it's important to evaluate your culture is that culture is either built every day or it's eroded every day. So it's got to be monitored for its health and well-being. There's a gentleman named Ray Davis who's a CEO of a bank. Um, he said several years ago that maintaining your culture is a little bit like having a teenager, monitoring what your teenager is doing. And sometimes you have to implement some tough love along the way if things aren't going so well. And I just think that's an interesting way to look at it. That the fifth reason why it's important to evaluate your culture is that culture is a must for sustained success. So you need to understand, is my culture helping me get where I want to go with my company, or is it holding me back from that progress? Culture can be a source of competitive advantage. Just ask Southwest Airlines. Because it's difficult to duplicate. So you do want to make sure that you're maintaining the most positive, effective culture that you can. Another question we get asked is, what's the difference between culture and climate? Are they the same or are they different? Well, as I've defined organizational culture for you, it's the values, the beliefs, the customs, the traditions, the rituals, even symbols that are associated on a traditional, consistent basis. Climate is atmosphere. Just like we use the word climate in describing weather, it's can be looked at that way with a company, that it's created based on and because of your culture. So it's perceptions and attitudes and feelings about what it's like to work at a company that really describes climate more than anything else. And there's been a lot of effort in the last several years to do employee engagement surveys and to study this important topic. And there have been some great and insightful statistics that have come out of that. The sad thing is that the needle hasn't moved very much in the last 5 to 10 years of studying employee engagement. We still have a lot of employees reporting that they're disengaged. And my perspective that I want to share with you this morning is because probably just focusing on climate is what that's doing. They're gauging more employee satisfaction with things. And when what we really need is a culture shift, not just a focus on climate. So rather than evaluating how well your company is doing at implementing new ideas, dealing with challenges, solving problems, focusing on that original culture that you wanted to create to be most effective, you might be measuring the wrong thing if you're only focusing on climate surveys. Even if you run into a survey, it's called a Great Workplace Survey, it might be called a culture survey, it's actually a climate survey. Employees are asked things like this: is the mission clear? Are benefits good? Does management show appreciation to you? Is teamwork encouraged? And so forth. It's not to say that it's unimportant to do a climate survey. It is important because it's helping you know what the perceptions are about the organizational culture. The challenge is oftentimes what you're getting into is an action plan that becomes either unusable or it's not used. It's put on the shelf, it's gathering dust. Oh, we did our climate survey, we did our due diligence, but then nothing's done with that information. That's a culture issue, not a climate issue. What is it about your culture that's causing that action plan from the climate survey to put on a shelf and nothing's being done about it? That's what you have to ask yourself. So that leads me to my next question. Why is it a problem to focus on climate only? There's a gentleman named Edgar Schein, who's considered a culture expert. He wrote the Handbook of Organizational Culture and Climate. He said this: a climate can be locally created by what leaders do, what circumstances apply, and what environments offer. So just like the weather can change from one location to another, or depending on how many clouds are present, how much snow is on the ground, all of those things impact the atmosphere, the climate. Those things like leaders and circumstances and environments can come and go and can change. Culture, he says, comes from mutual experience and shared learning. That's a powerful difference. He also says there's value in understanding how they both influence your work. A focus only on changing climate may lead you to some quick wins. For example, your managers might temporarily engage employees more effectively, but unless you've got a culture shift going along with it too, that change might be short-lived. And here's an example. And let me share that with you word for word. A company could have a culture where every meeting is conducted in a dictatorial fashion and participants are discouraged from saying anything that questions organizational policies and practices. The CEO could realize that innovation and new ideas are being stifled because employees are prevented from speaking frankly. The best way to bring about a change is to ensure that the top management team alters the manner in which it conducts meetings. Makes sense? Employees should be allowed to speak freely without fear of being reprimanded. And I would add to that, that's great. I would wholeheartedly want that to be happening. If it's consistently done, and if people are held accountable to those things, the existing practice in the company could undergo a change because there's a new cultural norm that's being expected of everybody. Shane goes on to warn, though, that don't be fooled by the illusion that when you change behavior, you are changing the underlying culture. So, just as I said earlier, culture trumps strategy, it also trumps climate. So, important to remember that. So, the last question I want to bring to you is, so how can I gain a better understanding of the existing culture in my company? Well, a good thing to do is to ask yourself some questions. Things like this: how is the organization currently functioning? Ask yourself. If you have employees, ask employees. What unwritten rules have become the norm and why? And what's the reasoning behind it? Is it like the ham story? Is it just because we've always done it this way? Your goal through whatever method you use to gain greater insight is to have that deeper understanding of whether or not your culture is effective. So instead of asking questions that are normally on a climate survey that gauge employee satisfaction levels, there's a suggestion, and this comes from the Human Synergistics Organizational Culture Inventory, to ask things like this. Ask employees if they are expected, or if there's an implication that they are expected, to check decisions with superiors, work to achieve self-set goals. Are they expected to, or is there an implication that they should point out flaws, take on challenging tasks, never make a mistake, not rock the boat, know the business, make a good impression? When you look at examples like this, what's really surfacing are those underlying perceptions and those unwritten rules. And don't be fooled by telling yourself, well, I've put company values in place. I have guiding principles in place. Remember what Shine said earlier, that so much happens with those perceptions, but it's really your culture that's driving that underlying behavior, those unwritten rules. I know I've worked for organizations that had values that we call espoused values. They're the values that are on the wall but not in the halls, as they say. So the real culture was, oh, this is a place that ignores values. This is a place where you don't need to honor, or you're not expected to honor those values and those principles because the top management isn't doing it. The executives aren't doing it. I had a client ask me one time, well, what's the best thing I can do to make sure that my employees are following these principles? And I said, the absolute number one thing that you can do as the business owner is to model the way. You set the tone, you set the prime example, and that is so very, very true. So, a lot of evaluating your company culture starts with taking a good look at yourself as well. What are your tendencies, your habits, and your practices? What values and beliefs are guiding your behavior? Are they the ones that are guiding your company culture? Probably they're one and the same when you're a small business owner. But look at whether or not you have contradictions going on. You're saying one thing but doing another. Maybe even worse, I worked for an organization where integrity was one of the values, and we saw lack of integrity all of the time. So uh, people won't follow something that they don't trust and they don't believe in. So, what are some methods you can use to actually gather information and evaluate your company culture? You can do observation. You can be like undercover boss. Um, Not literally, but just notice. That's one of the best things all of us can be better at is noticing. Notice what's going on in your company. Notice how people are interacting with each other, with customers. Notice whether or not systems are supporting the culture that you're trying to create. A lot of times on the Undercover Boss episodes, what they discovered was that they were asking people to live out and support a culture that they couldn't possibly honor because they had outdated systems, outdated technology, or they had cumbersome systems that got in the way of being able to fulfill a cultural element of how the company expected them to interact with a customer. So that observation is pretty powerful. If you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, ask someone else to come in and do it. And that outside help is another way to evaluate your company culture. It does help to have an objective third set of eyes. And remember too that potential employees are evaluating your culture. So think about, they're wondering, what's it like to work here? What's it like? What's the human interaction like? What's the systems and processes will I be expect to work within? What kind of decision making and power is going on in this company? What are the communication styles and protocols like? Employees are asking those questions of you too. In fact, I ran across an article just yesterday that said, when you're asked, do you have any questions in a job interview, you should be asking things like, what's your purpose beyond profit? What are your cultural values and so forth? So keep that in mind that other people are evaluating your culture too. I want to close out this morning by thanking you for being here with me and let you know that next week's topic is workplace civility, a very important topic that we're going to have a lot of good discussion over, and we look forward to sharing with you. Want to remind you too, we always have guest spots open. We look forward to hearing from you. If you're interested in being a guest, you can email Melissa and I at businessminds@email.com or message us on our Business Minds Facebook page. Remember too that we're always looking for your input as to what topics you'd like to have us feature on future shows. This is a program for you, and we would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
PeoriaLife.com